So yeah, thank you for coming to the sort of 9 o'clock session. It's really nice to see lots of familiar and new faces. So I'm presenting this work on behalf of many co-authors, Madeline and Rob, who couldn't make it because they've just had their second child. Maybe I should have put a picture of their baby in the presentation. But anyway, so I'm Rachel Clarke. So there's Charles, Anna, Kristina and Geraldine, also part of this paper. And it's on emotion work and experience-centred design. And in the nature of this proposal, I am excited, also slightly anxious and nervous about presenting this work on behalf of my colleagues, so I hope I do an okay job. So just to give an overview of what the talk will cover, so I'll just give a brief background of the motivation and how we came to this work and how we started thinking about emotion work in experience-centred design in particular. We'll then just give a brief overview of the kind of, I guess, a theoretical framework around emotion work and some of the case studies that we looked at, and just present a brief summary of the provocations and strategies approaching these provocations that we came at as a response, which we've been working with probably over the last decade, but without kind of writing about it. So, why is emotion work important? So, very briefly, our turn to experience and experience-centred design and the focus of emotions of participants for designing and developing enriching experiences and aesthetic experiences with technology rather than just functional or usability issues. But alongside that, there's been an emergent body of work that discusses the emotions of researchers, particularly within sensitive areas of human experience, so like bereavement, violence, abuse, or illness. And so some of the emotions that have been discussed in this work relate to things like tensions, uncertainty, ambivalence, or discomfort. Often these are mentioned, but not necessarily well articulated. Or not really closely connected to some of the design decisions that are made. And there's some areas of research that actually advocate for us not talking about our, particularly the negative emotions associated with research, and talking about these experiences maybe in the corridor or maintaining very clear, distinct professional boundaries so that we don't build particular kinds of relationships that puts us at risk of particular sort of emotional harm. But we were finding this problematic increasingly because, so what do we do about those experiences that make us feel pain or actually sometimes make us feel vile or abject or ashamed or guilty or completely incompetent when we're doing research? What are we supposed to do with that? I know that I've certainly felt that at various stages of my research career, at the beginning, but also, in several other projects as I've become more experienced. And so, what are we supposed to do with those feelings? And for us, as we were progressing, I guess, in our careers, we felt that by failing to portray the emotion work of experience-centred design, actually we fail to share and learn. And I think the key thing is here that we fail to learn from those experiences as a field, how we can use and navigate our own emotions to guide and influence our practices. So, emotion work beyond HCI. Do you like the picture of the air hostess there? And this is an Arlie Hochschild, by the way. So Arlie Hochschild, we looked at the work of sociologist Arlie, who first looked at issues associated with emotion work with air hostesses and the burden that this would place on them in their careers. But she also found that emotion work, and it's sometimes called emotional labour, but we're kind of drawing from Hochschild's work in particular to frame our work. But she also found that the same experiences were discussed across teaching, nursing and counselling, which also have significant amounts of face-to-face interaction. In particular, in the paper, what we draw from was the experience of giving an outward expression of an emotion that conflicts with our inner feelings. And that requires us to regulate our emotion, particularly when that conflict is against the rules of a context that's required of us in a particular role. So a really good example, and we've all probably seen it, is how the air hostess feels she has to smile even when she's getting her bottom slapped or something hideous like that. So, the fact that there are professional ways that we have to present our emotions, despite that being in conflict with what we might feel inside. And for Hochschild, she also evidenced how this could lead to experiences of guilt, feelings of inauthenticity when you're feeling like you have to perform a role, self-blame, distress, and eventual job dissatisfaction, particularly if the emotion work wasn't recognised as part of your work. And so this has potential implications for researchers. And in the literature, Hochschild talks about these issues associated with emotional exhaustion, which can lead to unconstructive reflections, but also retellings of things like researchers' own life and past in ways that might not be conducive to the research itself. So, as a way of understanding how we might talk about emotion work within HCI and experience-centred design, we took 5 case studies. So the first one in the paper, there's much more detail, so I'm just going to briefly overview. So Digital Stories and Portraits was my first and second PhD study, so working in an international women's centre where the design intervention was about supporting women who had experiences of domestic violence. And the vignette that I provide in there talks about hiding these emotions from the women and being quite shocked about the way that they have been treated as they're telling these stories. Motivating Mobility was a project with Madeline and Geraldine. It was a project about designing technical interventions for stroke rehabilitation. So in the case studies that we describe, Madeline describes the experience of the prototype not working as anticipated, and the horrible moment where she has to do the kind of final interview and the participant is really upset, and prior to that having a really strong relationship with this participant. Diabetes in Malaysian teenagers. So this was a project with Madeline and Rob. It was quite a short-term project, quite intensive, emotionally intensive, where they were working together on co-design for developing technical interventions for young people with diabetes, type 2 diabetes, to manage exercise and eating. And in the story that we provide, they talk about the challenge that they faced in building the relationship initially with the teenagers, but also then how to confront getting Facebook friend requests and managing the relationship once the project was complete. And finally, within the context of design, we've got 2 case studies as part of Kia's research group. There's the Breathing Light and Soma Mat, which is Anna Stahl's PhD research, which, and I've got to say this right, which was about a meditative, I'll say it slowly, a meditative, introspective approach to body awareness and improving body awareness and relaxation. And what Anna talks about is the installation of the artifacts. So you can see the mat and the lights there at the bottom right. So Anna talks about the installation of these artifacts in people's homes and that sense of awkwardness and embarrassment and how they didn't quite fit, and then having to take it away because that's part of the design process. You kind of install it for 3 months and then you take it away and then you kind of evaluate it. And finally, a technique called contact improvisation, that's again part of Kia's work on Soma design, is a technique to encourage researchers to come together and open up by quite a physical, you can see the picture there, quite a physical push and pull of interactions, bodily interactions. And in the article, Kia and Charles talk about their experiences of negotiating their positions as supervisor and PhD student and the kind of sensitivities around that. So how did we attempt to surface our emotion work? So we were quite happy to talk about, I guess, in the corridor, these emotions associated with these experiences, and they continued to resonate. The thing that we were really struck by is they continued to resonate, and some of this work has kind of spans about a decade. But when we wrote these short pieces around some of the emotion work that we were discussing with each other, and then we realised that actually what we'd first written, we avoided all the emotion work. So we were like, okay, this is quite interesting. So we then had to do something much more deliberate, where we almost partnered up with one another and spoke about some of the experiences. Some of us had a bit of a cry, and then wrote these more detailed accounts. And this is a process called mutual collaboration, which is used in nursing quite a bit because nurses are often very action-oriented, and during training, they often find it quite hard to deal with some of the emotions and the actions that they're kind of dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So this is often used as a way of kind of coupling them together to surface some of those complexities of their work. So that enabled us to have a much kind of richer, detailed account of our emotion work. So what did we talk about? And I won't go into detail. I did do a slide with lots of quotes, but then I couldn't get through it in 15 minutes, so I thought, just go to the paper. And it's really hard presenting other people's voices when they're sat in the room. So I'll just try to do the best overview that I can. But there was a consistent reference to kind of managing and hiding our feelings, particularly in front of our participants, but also in relation to other colleagues, and how we, because that would sometimes make us feel incompetent, or we didn't want to pass on vicariously some of the emotions that we were feeling inside of horror or shock or pain. But that was also quite difficult, because often we were trying to produce an emotional state in others. Often when we're doing any kind of user research, we're often trying to, whether wittingly or unwittingly, trying to facilitate some kind of trust so that we can also encourage openness within that process. And that's kind of in conflict to us managing and hiding our feelings. And so that in this way, the designer's role exerts control. And Anna's project really talks nicely about this, how the artifact, in a way, how we kind of manage when we're doing interaction design and we have particular artifacts, can create feelings of guilt and shame, because we give them and we take them back, or we have a certain amount of control over those artifacts and how they're deployed. And that can in itself create these feelings. So in the paper, what we talk about is, rather than saying this is what everybody should do and a set of guidelines, what we come up with are 3 provocations, and I've got 2 minutes, so I'll try and rattle through these as best as I can. So the first one is, being human is not enough. So in our case studies, we talked about these kind of moments where we try to kind of negotiate our emotions. But we are designers, and we're in a professional context, and so we need ways of reflecting on our emotion much more. And then formally sharing that emotion work, so whether that's within our research teams, but we would advocate for that within our publications. Provocation 2, so questioning the professional. So if emotion is a tool of our trade, which I think we probably all agree it is, then maintaining boundaries isn't always desirable or possible. In some contexts it is, but not always. And sometimes we want to play with those boundaries, and certainly, but that needs to be considered in the context of self-care and institutional care. So in the paper, what we talk about, because there's a lot of discussion about the ethical procedures and managing the risk of emotionally difficult experiences for researchers, but those responsibilities are often kind of placed on individuals, and we want to see that much more within a community practice, not just individuals. And finally, which got the most discussion from reviewers, was resisting our urge to engage participants in design. So what we're saying here is, do we always have to engage people as the first point of contact? Do we need other ways to sensitize? So in a way, preparing for our motion work and designing a laddered approach so we engage with other kinds of methods, art, literature, social media, designing artifacts that we can try out, and autoethnography, working out how we feel about those particular issues that we're working with. So I'll quickly summarize. So in the paper, we advocate for a more thorough appreciation of emotion work in experience-centred design through writing informal publications, to rethink what it means to be a professional within experience-centred design, accepting that emotion plays a huge role in both enabling and yet sometimes hindering our work and crossing boundaries when it feels right. But there's also careful consideration on these alternative ways in which we can encounter experiences as a pathway to understanding and preparing for emotion work in the field. And that's everything. Thank you very much for listening.
Yeah.
So thank you very much for a nice topic and an important topic. So I don't really have a question, but I thought I'll just share one of my emotional experiences from the field.
Share how you feel.
I was once conducting an interview with some HIV patients, particularly poor and less literate, less educated HIV patients. And one of the interviews kind of stayed with me for a very, very long time. This was a poor farmer who has traveled 700 kilometers and, in fact, to a big city, a very fairly expensive clinic. And he did not really understand what he was getting into. He did not understand HIV. And so I asked him, how are you paying for this? And he said, well, the last time I came, I sold a cow. And this time I came, I sold a cow. So I asked him, how many cows do you have? And he said, 6. So, and he has to make monthly visits to the clinic. And that sort of broke my heart. I didn't know what to do with him. Mm-hmm. So that was the story.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing the story.
Thanks for the talk. Very interesting. Gilly Leshed from Cornell. So the emotion work that you described is situated around interactions between researchers and study participants. And I wonder if this can be extended to other kinds of emotional experiences in HCI design, such as interactions with other researchers, working around high workloads and deadlines, finding out that there isn't really there in your data, these kinds of emotional experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in the paper, Kia's and Charles' example is a really good example because it's actually that kind of, it's not necessarily perceived as a sensitive context, but the interactions between professor and PhD student can often be quite fraught because there are these hierarchies. And so if you're trying to build these open relationships, it's quite challenging. But absolutely, I mean, we can kind of find emotion work in a lot of research, right? But even in presenting. But I think the key that we were trying to get at here is how, instead of trying to say, because we came across so many papers that had started to talk about this several years ago, and they were just like, oh, but you have to leave it out of the research. You have to leave it out. And actually, we're kind of doing ourselves a disservice, actually, by trying to design these pleasurable experiences, but then not really understanding that there are other kinds of experiences that make us human. So yeah, I think we're going to keep working on the technique. We've been using it within our research teams, respectively. So yeah, but I'm using it with other disciplines who are really anti doing this, which is very interesting what you were saying.
Hi, Norman Su, Indiana University. I love the talk. Just a quick question. I don't know if you had some thoughts about, so I'm used to writing about what, when you do field work, about what people are doing, but how do you write about what people are feeling? I don't know if you have any thoughts about how do you write about that? Do you have to, are there different strategies or ways to do that? I don't know. How do you write about emotions?
The emotions of other people.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of hard, unless you've got, they're talking about it, or they pull a particular face, or they do something with their body. So often I just talk about it in very sort of practical, if they pull a face, but they say something, different, you know, like when you've got those kind of conflicts in what people do and what they say and what facial expressions. I just write because I can't know what they feel for sure, and I think this is why it's important, the kind of autoethnography kind of work that we do around to acknowledge how we actually feel in response to some of these issues. Because I think if we don't understand ourselves, then it's really difficult to understand others.
Let's thank our presenter again. And it is now time for a coffee break.